Hey guys, my name is Mannequin and welcome back to Mastering EDM with Logic Pro. I have a cold today. Hopefully that doesn't get in the way of this recording, but I just wanted to mention one other thing. I recorded this video already, but it turned out since I had to reset up my computer and everything, since I moved, the audio was set up at a different USB port and it didn't record any of the audio. So that video is basically useless now. So hopefully I can pack this into the amount of time I have right now. I'll try not to let this be rushed, but I do want to cover a whole bunch of things. So one thing that I did want to kind of show you guys from the last video was we talked about limiting and basically how it brings up the volume. Now, what does this really do? Basically, it gets from this to this. That's what the limiting and compression does. So this is kind of like before all the mastering. This is after all the mastering. You'll notice here I have two EQs, and today's video is on EQ. So I did already do the EQ, but I'm not going to use those. I will show you them later, though, just kind of show you how the EQ I make right now is going to be very similar to the one I created before. Not because I'm actually referencing these ones, but more because I kind of go off of a certain sound. So we have that, and like I said, today's video is going to be on EQing. You can see by the title. But I always like to mention that here just in case I get things backwards or something and someone can mention, hey, you got the video and the title different. Okay. So without further ado, let's get in here. Now, with mastering by way of EQ, there are two main ways you want to EQ. One is to kind of stylistically shape the sound, and the other is to correct things. So we have shaping and correction. I don't think I wrote them down here last time. So we'll do this. Sound shaping and correctional EQ. So the two different types of things here, I'm going to actually start with correctional EQ because it's the easier one to talk about. Because most of the time, if you're mastering your own tracks, you won't have to worry about it. Correctional EQ, the purpose of that is when you go into master, hi Firefox, I don't really care. But when you go into master, you usually want to look for issues in the sound signature that are not like good at all. So for instance, if you have way too much sub bass or something like that, then you really want to correct things by using this EQ. Additionally, let's say you have the entire track is awesome, but the snares, whenever the snares come in, they're just way too harsh. So that would be under correctional EQ as well. So this is basically what you're trying to do with correctional EQ is you're trying to find different parts of the track and try to fix them when you don't have the original mix to actually go in and fix the individual tracks. So you're kind of using EQ to look at this entire spectrum here and just kind of adjust things without having to go in and actually change each individual track. Now, most of the time, you only do this when you're mastering other people's tracks. And most of the time, you want to avoid doing this if you can. If you can't avoid it, then you are going to have to do some of it. But otherwise, you want to try to avoid it if there's just like one small issue that's just like maybe there's an effect that comes in once in the entire track and it's just like too harsh or has too much bass or something like that, then you want to try to leave that alone. But if it is a consistent problem throughout the track, you're going to want to fix it. So the biggest issue here most of the time is that there is going to be a spot with too much bass. This one actually has a particular issue in regards to the snare that comes in later, if I recall correctly. But that one, it's not that big of an issue when we go in and we do the sound shaping. Sound shaping is going to be a lot more about getting the track, and let's say we have a great mix down, but the balance of the EQ is slightly off. We'll listen to this track again in a second here, and I should actually turn the volume down so it doesn't, it's not really loud. What's going to happen here is you're going to notice that it sounds really good, but actually I'm going to shape the sound and make it so it kind of conforms to standards, and I'll talk about why that is. But first I'm going to let you just listen to the track here so you kind of get a feel of how it sounds and how good the mix is, and then I'll talk about I'll talk about why I'm going to do what I'm about to do, and then I'm going to show you the process of doing it. So without further ado, let's get it and listen to some of this track. I'm going to kind of jump around. Please excuse me in that regard, but I just want to try to get you to hear the various parts without it totally taking too much time here. So here we go. Okay, that kind of gives you an idea of what the track sort of sounds like. Most of the track does kind of sound like this, so you don't need to worry too much about the other sections there. They're very similar in sound. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing. If you notice, this is the track from last time, Dava's track, Club Life. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to use the same looped area to kind of start working through this track and basing the EQ off this area, because this area is the one spot that has a couple problem frequencies that we'll need to deal with, but it's not that big of a deal. So what is sound shaping? Sound shaping is essentially getting the sound of your track and kind of getting it to conform to the standards more or less. Let me turn on the high on my microphone here so it's not as harsh. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay, so what we have, this track actually kind of follows the same way I tend to mix, and that is there's a lot more bright high end and a lot more of the body is around here, and then you have some nice sub. That's what my tracks tend to do, and that's actually what Dava's track is doing here. Now, on the other hand, what tends to happen is with the industry standard, you tend to actually have more of the high end around here instead of way up here. And if you actually hear in my microphone right now, the part that whenever I say a letter S, that's what's coming through really sharp right here. And so what we're going to do with the EQ is we're actually going to shape the sound so more of it is coming from around this area, and then more of the body is coming from around this area. Instead of the deep sub, we're going to kind of pull it up a little bit. And then we're going to cut around this area, because when we boost around here, we're going to get a lot more body that causes this part to sound muddy. So I'll kind of walk you through what I'm doing as I'm doing it. But the first thing I want to talk about is cuts. So usually you're kind of inclined to want to keep the very crisp high end and also keep the very low sub. But in the case of most music, you'll actually be able to listen to it and tell that it kind of rolls off. And it's sometimes referred to as an analog roll-off. And that's because when you run a sound through analog gear, it tends to actually do some distortion, or you get some signal loss for the high end, and it kind of tends to roll off the very high frequencies or kind of shift them down to this area. So that's why we do that, because originally when we were using analog equipment instead of digital, most of the sound would be around this kind of area instead of catching all the high end and catching all the very deep lows. So that's kind of what started that, but it has kind of created a signature sound that better translates to more speakers, because if you have a lot of high end right here and you have a lot of lows right here, and you don't have much focus in the in-between parts here and here, what will happen is your mix, if you go on low quality speakers, the high end will either be non-existent or will be extremely harsh, because low quality speakers can cut off the high end right here, or they can try to accentuate it to make it sound a lot nicer, so people will be like, ooh, I want these because the high end's very bright. But when your mix comes in and your mix isn't set to that standard that everybody's kind of using, you'll have a lot right here, and then when it boosts it in those cheap speakers, it'll suddenly be like tearing your ears out because it's so harsh. Similarly, in the low end, either the speakers won't be able to reproduce it, or, like in the case of Beats, the bass will be just basically skyrocketed, and then everything will sound so bassy that you won't be able to hear anything else. So you kind of need a cutoff around here to tame some of this, just to kind of let the sound shine through. So how does this translate to what we're listening to right now? So I'm going to turn this up just a tiny bit so we could hear a little bit better. And then what's going to happen here is I'm going to play this back, and I'm going to show you, we're going to do some roll-offs here. I'm going to cut here and cut here. First, I'm actually going to start with the high end. I'm going to pull this all the way up and set it to the steepest curve here. As you kind of see here, there's a couple options. I'm going to set it to the steepest one. That's 40 decibels per octave. I'm going to bring that all the way up, and I'm going to slowly slide it down. You could kind of listen to what's going on in the high end as I slide this down, and you could tell that you'll actually be able to tell something interesting as I'm doing this. I'm not going to mention it right now. You could actually listen for yourself and see if you could tell what's happening as I do this. Actually, you might notice it's what's not happening. So without further ado, let's play this back here and start rolling this off. So you could kind of tell there that there wasn't that much change that you could hear. Now, that is kind of partially to the fact that I am gradually changing it, which means our brains kind of tend to get more used to slow changes. So if I were to do a boost here very slowly over time, your brain would kind of get used to it, and it wouldn't seem like that big of a boost unless we just suddenly dropped it out and stuff like that. So it isn't really a fair comparison, just kind of show you how little it was doing there. But if I go here and I switch it on and off, you'll notice that this area isn't actually having much happen to it when I cut. Now, if you listen very closely, you kind of hear there's a sparkle in the high end that goes away, but otherwise it remains relatively unchanged. So I'm going to show you this again, kind of A/B it and switching it on and off. And then I'm going to talk to you why I'm actually bothering to cut this, other than getting, the sound shaping to be right. So here we go. Listen to it one more time, and we'll kind of A/B this. So when we have this this cut on, it kind of loses some of the sheen at the very, very, very high end. But actually, you guys might not be able to hear that, not because I'm saying, oh, you guys don't have good enough ears, you might not be able to hear that. This is actually a case where you might not be able to hear this because this high end is going to be lost to some degree in the encoding when I finish saving this video, and then when I edit it and upload it to YouTube. There's going to be a couple things that happen by way of encoding, and it might get lost entirely, so you might not even hear that. So that's partially why we're actually cutting this here. Especially in the case of SoundCloud, if you have a lot of high end here and you upload it to SoundCloud, what's going to happen is this information is going to get lost, but it's going to get lost in a horrid way. And what's going to happen is when you have something that normally sounds like it's going to start sounding like, which sounds kind of, like a drastic difference, but really it is. If you just get high frequency white noise, which means you just kind of drop in some white noise here and filter it out so it's only high end, and then you upload that to YouTube, you'll notice it won't sound like a nice, it'll just start to get really grainy and disgusting sounding. So that's what we're avoiding here. By cutting this area out, we're actually helping to reduce the amount of high end that gets shot into the encoders. And what happens is that allows the encoders to produce better sound in the end because it's not good at dealing with high frequency material. Just because the way there's a lot more data in high frequency material that it has to deal with, so it tries to cut down on how much work it does in that regard whenever it can, which causes high ends to be lost quite a bit in the encoding processes. So that's one of the reasons mathematically why we'd actually cut that out, but also artistically, if we cut this out, it kind of keeps things from getting too harsh in the end. So now I'm going to cut the low end in a similar way. You'll also notice that if I do a very steep cut here, bring this all the way back, and if I ease it in, I could show you guys here, but I'm just going to do this very briefly. You kind of listen here. So what you'll notice here is that when I cut this, you could probably barely tell what was going on, just because low end is a lot harder to tell when you're cutting stuff. But essentially, I didn't actually even bring it up to where it was very obvious that it was being cut out, and I can't, honestly, I can't tell that much just because I'm running through headphones. I can't use my monitors as much as I'd like to use my monitors right now. I can't because it creates a feedback loop, so I have to use headphones, so I can't really hear all that much that's changing around here. So I'm actually going to tell you one number that in the world of mixing and EDM production and stuff like that, this is actually a number that you could write down and kind of just keep. Usually when you're cutting the low end for a master, 30 hertz is a good bet. If you just want to slap on a cut, then you could just drop it around 30 hertz. You don't need to pull it up much higher or much lower. Actually, if you pull it down lower, you'll probably end up with bad results. So if anything, I'd say go slightly above 30 hertz. And what you're doing here is you're cutting out the low end that just kind of sounds bad in general. So if you play it over a very loud system, like a PA system at an event, then what'll happen is this sub will start to feel very awkward and it will not sound good. So we're actually cutting this, and this is part of the analog roll-off too, because the analog equipment tends to roll this off, if I recall correctly, the same way it does high end. It just kind of gets lost or distorted, and it tends to not go down quite as deep. So now that does kind of vary depending on the equipment you're using. But low end does kind of tend to taper off a lot more with older equipment. Additionally, you may think that this sub sounds good on your monitors, which is kind of, one of the cases. Similarly, I said with the high end, the sparkle may sound good through your monitors or mixing headphones. But when you go to the low end, the same is actually true. It might sound good on your monitors or headphones, but as soon as you bring it to a bad speaker system, or especially a PA, this will instantly show through as being a area that you have to worry about. So right now we're cutting this just to kind of keep this buildup from happening, because otherwise if someone plays it at a gig, a DJ plays it at a gig for you, and you're just like, you haven't played it on PAs before, then what'll happen is this kind of start to build up and you'll get a lot of just kind of like this I can't really show you guys all that much just because it's a very deep sort of sound that you feel in your body more, and it just kind of feels wrong. This area is very good for the sub that you want to feel on a large system, and sort of leading into this area as well, but you want to be careful because this area does not feel good because it's so low frequency, it starts to rumble, and you can actually start to feel it kind of pulsing in and out when you have a steady sub going, which is not a good thing at all. You kind of want it to go with the music, and if you just have this sound that's kind of moving around irregardless of the music, then it's not a good thing. So we've got these two cuts, which kind of makes sense, and now the question is, how are we actually going to shape the sound? This is where things start to become a lot more stylistic. So there are a couple of options here. I'm actually going to run the standard Electro House shaping. Now, that doesn't mean there's actually like a little guide out there that says this is the standard Electro House shaping. I'm actually going with what I hear throughout most Electro House. When you go into Tropical House and you go into Deep House and you go into Trance and you go into various styles of EDM. Now, actually, Electro House and Dubstep have the same sound by way of sound shaping. But other styles that have a different signature, they'll kind of do different, go into different directions. A lot of them will have a more open sound, or they might have a more dead sound. It kind of depends on the style. For the life of me, I think This Is the End, or no, it's not This Is the End. The track is called The End. I don't remember the artist for the life of me, but that track, if I recall correctly, sounds a lot more toned down and has a lot less high end than some other tracks would in the EDM field. So you got to kind of realize that this is just what I'm pulling for this particular track. For you, you're going to want to find some songs that you listen to and find their general sound signature, and then you'll want to kind of conform it to that. But I'll show you a handy guideline for just generally speaking all around that you could use later. And that'll be a handy thing for you to keep in mind. But for now, we're just going to kind of go with the general thing that's going on for Electro House. So what do we do with Electro House? Electro House, we tend to focus a lot of the sound around here and around here. So when you see on the EQ analyzer, it'll actually kind of show a nice, cool pattern that you could watch. But there are some things that you want to keep an eye out for. So what are we going to do first? What we're actually going to do is we're going to find the nice spot around this high end, and we're actually going to be able to tone down some of this very high end and replace it with this. I'll show you how that works right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a nice sweep, and I'm just going to do a very wide boost over here and kind of show you what I'm talking about. Okay, here we go. So you could tell there, really what's going on is we have basically this boosts the loudness right off the bat. So I kind of talked about in my previous video with limiting, it was one of the two things that really brings up the loudness of your sound. This is the second thing. When we EQ this correctly, according to the standards, we'll actually get it louder as well. So you'll notice that this really boosted the high end, despite the fact it kind of sounded like we were boosting over here, even though we are actually boosting around here. And that's because we're doing a very wide boost and we're doing it a small amount. Normally, my recommendation is actually try to shoot for less than 2 decibels boosts whenever you do them. So in this case, I'm trying to do this very quickly, so I'm not paying as much attention. But I'm gonna nail this EQ here in front of you guys, because I want to try to show you guys generally how everything is going to be a subtle boost. Because when you start to boost something to around like 3.7, like you kind of had, what'll happen is it'll sound okay, but you'll start to get a sound that kind of sounds like the song has been shaped and bent instead of just instead of you knowing that it's been shaped and everybody else not being able to tell. So what'll happen is you'll start to hear it'll sound like regions are cut out. It's like if I had this at around 4.3 or something. And then I kind of boosted the bass, and it would be kind of the electro house sound, but we lose too much in the mids here, and it sound too thin and harsh, despite the fact that it has a lot of high end and a lot of bass. So my suggestion is try to keep the boosts definitely under 3, under 2 if you can. So we'll kind of just leave this sitting around here. I'm going to show you one other thing. Now that we've boosted this, we could actually turn down the high end a little bit to kind of tone down the harshness, because you'll notice there is a lead synthesizer in here that's kind of going on, and it's very harsh. So that's one of the things that I wanted to touch on by way of correctional EQ. So by way of correctional EQ, I do want to bring this down just a notable amount to kind of catch that high end and kind of tame it a little bit so it's not very harsh in other people's speakers. But at the same time, we could boost around here to give the track a little bit more loudness and to bring up the brightness a little bit without worrying about the very harsh sound that comes from the crispiness over here. So I'm going to play this back and kind of tweak these around a little bit, just kind of show you guys what to look for by way of EQing the high end. So here we go. Okay, that's pretty good there. Now you could tell right off the bat that this is already changing the sound quite a bit. If I were to disable this and turn it, actually let's do that. We'll just play it back and I'll turn it off and then turn it on. We'll kind of see how it sounds. So you could hear there, the original track does kind of sound nicer, just because it's got a lot of the more open high-end sound, and it feels like it has a lot of body and stuff. So it kind of feels like we're losing stuff here. You'll notice that also I shifted this up a little bit. It was around here before. I kind of shifted it up. That was to kind of keep the brightness of the original sound. And then this as well, I kind of turned this, made it so it was doing a little bit less of a gain reduction there, and then I kind of pulled it out a little bit more so it kind of more gradually affect this curve. So if you see what I'm doing with this this little the shelf is basically I'm just trying to take this, instead of going down and then cut, I'm trying to actually, if you watch the curve, this was not intentional by what I was looking at, just kind of how it turned out. It made this curve go a lot smoother into that cut. Instead of having this kind of link, we have a nice kind of graduated, it pulls it down, and then it starts to do a harsh cut there. So that's what kind of ended up happening. But that's kind of, you know, I wasn't watching it and looking for that. I was listening for that, and that's kind of just how it ended up. So it kind of makes sense what I'm doing now here. Now I could go in and I could actually take the mids and cut them. Like I told you, we're trying to move focus away from this area around 200 here, because that has some body. You'll actually, if you listen here. That has a lot of stuff that'll fill out and sound like it's very full. So we kind of tend to do that with these mixes. If you listen here. It has a very high end up here, and then it kind of has that fullness right there, and then it has a little bit of sub. So we're trying to shift that away, just because the reason is, you know, like I said, we're trying to get that EDM sort of sound. So I'm trying to shape the tone in that regard, and I'm also trying to get it to translate best across speaker systems. So I'm going to set this to 0 again, not 9. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually take the sub and pull it up. So we're not going to actually cut here. That's kind of what I was trying to get at. We're not going to actually cut there. Instead, we're going to take something else and we're going to boost around it. So we'll take this here. We're just going to do a kind of wide boost to around this area to kind of get more punch. And then we'll go and we'll actually do one more EQ tweak, and then I think we'll be good. So you'll notice that's where a lot of the thwump is, so I kind of want to catch that. So you'll notice it does still sound a little bit muddy when we boost that, but now the kick has quite a bit more bass, so it kind of feels heavier. So this is the final thing we're going to do here, and that's we're going to take up the presence. The presence, as I tend to describe it, is around 1K to 2K. So we're actually going to take this and we're going to make this a little bit more of a wider shelf. You notice that with this one, I tried to make it as wide as I could. I don't think I could widen this anymore, actually. No, I can. But I don't want it to be boosting in the high end. So I'm going to have this where it was. See if I could readjust this. And then we're going to take this one here and we're just going to pull it up around here just so it kind of opens up this area more. And I'm not boosting the high end. Now I could just shift this down and widen it out, but you'll notice it's actually slightly different. What this does is this allows me, if I could zoom in, but I can't, just kind of look at it, and if you watch the edges, this one kind of gradually goes up, and this one's a little bit steeper, but at the top here we have kind of a plateau, whereas if I were to take this and widen it out, it kind of creates a hump instead of a plateau. So by using two of these, we create sort of a plateau there, and it'll allow us to get a slightly better control over this this particular sound that I want to deal with for this track. So I'm going to balance this in, and we'll see how it goes. So we did a couple things there, by way of just kind of showing you when I turned it off and turned it back on. You could tell that we did some major changes to the sound. But the deal is we actually, it may have sounded bad in some regards, but that's kind of a sacrifice we need to make. When we have too much high end, we do need to cut it out, even if it sounds good on our monitors. So that's one of the things about mastering, that's kind of making a call between do I cut something, or do I leave it in because it sounds nice. But you'll notice, just want to mention this really quick when I was what I was doing this one. When I kind of A/B'd this off and on, you can kind of hear that some of the body came back when I boosted this. So what did I do? We took the body from here, and we took the high end from here, and we shifted the high end to here. And we shifted the body that was here to here and here. These are the areas that work best on most speakers. If you have speakers that are okay, then they'll usually reach to around this area where the nice punch is. So you kind of get that punch there. And then you could, most speakers replicate this area relatively well. If you have a very bad speaker, typically it'll only get this area. So when we push most of the detail into this area and focus it by balancing the EQ and shaping the sound so that it works best in this area, then it sounds best on most people's speakers. Now for the high end, it's a lot harder to deal with because personally I haven't quite nailed the high end. I've gotten it pretty good and pretty close to Pro Tracks, but my biggest suggestion is listen to the tracks that you like and listen to the sound signature that you like from those professional tracks and kind of shape it based on those, kind of A-B back and forth. Does mine have the same amount of high end? And does mine have too much high end? Does it have too little high end? So I'm going to show you one tool now that we've kind of talked about, generally speaking, what we're doing here and how I'm shifting things around to kind of focus on the various areas. You can kind of tell when I A-B it apart from the high end. If I actually swap the high end here, just turn off these ones and then A-B between it, you'll notice that the sound will be pretty much better across the board. So now when I actually take off these cuts in the high end, it actually sounds better across the board. But the reason, like I said, there were some reasons as to why I chose to do these cuts, mostly just because it kind of, that's how this track kind of needs it, because of the way the high end is very harsh in the drop. So we kind of need to tone that down just a little bit. If he had taken that one high synthesizer out, or he had EQ'd that one slightly better so it wasn't quite as sharp in the high end, then I wouldn't have to do as much of a cut around here, and I could have actually let some more of it shine through just a little bit. But we do need to have a little bit of roll off there just to kind of deal with that. And I think there was one other part that had snares or something. Where was it? I don't know. Maybe I was just thinking about a different track that someone had sent me before. But anyway, so we did need to tame the high end for sure in this area. Just because that high synthesizer shouldn't sound as harsh. Now it's up to you. There's two things we could do here. One is we could actually tone down the roll off here to 36. Which makes it a little bit less obvious, and it still cuts out the high end, so I think that's what we'll actually do for this one. Now, I don't remember if I did that on my other one. Nope, I had this one at 48. I just kind of toned it slightly different. But you'll notice the EQs kind of turned out basically the same. Now, you would kind of say to yourself, but they look slightly different. Now, what I could do is I could actually boost this one up here, and you'll notice that they're basically the same thing once I gain match them. They're very similar. This one does have a lot wider and a lot more gradual of a bass on the bass there, but the mids are pretty much the same there, and then the this high part is pretty much the same, and this one's just got a little bit more cut in the middle there. Now, I actually might change that later depending on stylistically what I want, but you'll notice, despite everything, whoops, that's not what I want to do. I want to hit Alt. But it's basically the same thing as what I was doing, and I did in the last video, for the mix. So I covered a lot. There's a couple more things I want to cover by way of tools and things to look at. First of all, I am using a linear phase EQ, which is very important because you do not want to use a channel EQ for your master. It just kind of messes up your overall sound when you start EQing things. So use a linear phase EQ, and then one of the other things, unless you want a very Unless you want a more analog sort of sound, then you could use a different type of EQ, but I want a very more precise sound because this is, I am kind of EQing it based on the Electro House sort of standards, because this is kind of more suited for the drop than if I were to do like a, I don't know, Tropical House, Deep House sort of signature for this. So that's why I ended up going with the Electro House after all. Now, Electro House, Progressive House, pretty much the same style, but Progressive House does have a bit more variety in it. So anyway, some tools here. I flipped this little shade down, and I want to show you the analyzer options here. If I go to high, I turned on the analyzer, by the way, and then I'm going to change the analyzer decay in a second here, but first I want to show you what that does. So we have the analyzer running at high resolution. And you can kind of see overall we have this down-sloping trend. Actually, let me change decay and show you what that does. So basically, it just sits there and it shows you it doesn't decay at all. 0 decibels per second, so it doesn't go down anymore, it just kind of stays up. If you watch this, it kind of peaks here and then it goes down. There's a dip here and then it kind of goes down again. So that's generally the sound signature you'll find on most EDM tracks. This is a very, very, very widely used sound signature. Actually, if you watch the high end here when I take these off, watch what happens here. It doesn't really follow that trend anymore. It goes down and then kind of peaks here and then just cuts off. So normally you'll actually see this nice roll off here. That's that analog roll off I was talking about. And you could actually get, using this one thing I'm about to show you, you could get higher precision kind of watching your whole, your spectrum here. But this is one of the things you kind of want to look for. If it's sloping down, you have this nice dip around here. Normally it's around 200 hertz-ish, just because 200 hertz is a very difficult region in terms of big sound systems. When you're on when you're at a event and they have a whole bunch of PAs, this part sounds bad really fast. So if anything you want, if anything you want to kind of cut this area to kind of help ease in that shape there. But that's kind of up to the track and up to your decision as to if the track needs it or not. So I'm going to switch the analyzer decay to full here, and you kind of watch, it'll be a lot more active. So I am putting that cut there after all because I do like how it kind of gets the moneyness and turns it out. And then I think this one, I might want to try to boost. I'll boost wide over here, and then I'll do one more thing just to kind of show you guys something about mastering. First of all, mastering, you don't want to worry too much about how many EQ plugins you use, but you want to worry about more, the thought process behind it. I'm going to pop open another EQ, and I'm going to do one little thing here. Linear phase EQ, and then I'm just going to find the punchy spot. I'm going to find the punchy spot of the kick, and then boost that a little bit. That's right where I want it. So I'm going to pull this down here and make it this little bump right here. It makes the bass of the kick really show through a lot better. So so this is kind of, you don't have to worry about using multiple EQs. My only suggestion is make sure you know what you're doing. There's this one tool in Logic. If you go down to Audio Units, Apple, Graphic EQ, you'll have this, which basically allows you to have a lot more flexibility over the EQ. So instead of having these couple of bands here, we could do something like cut the high end, but say there's one part in the high end that's really good, so we kind of want to leave that out. Then we could kind of do this. So we have this one part here, it's downward sloping, except that this part sounds nice, so we kind of want to leave it as is instead of cutting it. So that it allows us a lot more flexibility. We could do these nice, bumps and adjustments, and say there's this one resonant spot right here, it's just really bad, we could cut that out. But you'll notice, if we were to do just these kind of simple things here, then we could actually, so that would have been 1 peak, 2, 3, actually that would have been 3, because over here 4, because that one small dent there, and then 5 down here, and then 6 because we need to boost right there. So how many would that take for a linear phase EQ? If we wanted to boost here, we'd have that one. Then we'd have one over here, right there. Then we'd have the one right here. And then there'd be a little bit of a notch right here. So we kind of narrow that out, put that notch there. And then we'd have to do this cut. And suddenly we don't have enough to actually do that one peak right there. We need to find a whole nother one, so we need to add another gain, not gain, we need to add another EQ plugin just to do that one extra notch right there. So that's what these graphic equalizers are good for. I've seen some, mostly is used for tuning sound systems actually, but it has been used for masters, although I don't suggest using Logic's built-in one because it's probably not that good for mastering. If you do find a graphic equalizer, then feel free to use that for mastering. My whole point here, though, is that as long as you know what you're doing, it's okay to have a couple gain plugins. So I have 2 here, and let me just set this back to what it was before. Basically, only this one right here. That was the only thing we were caring about for this one. And you can see that it's not any extreme thing still. It's just kind of like this nice curve here. And then this one extra little boost that would end up right on top of here just to give the cake a little bit extra punch. So, so that's why I'm doing 2 plugins. And it's not bad to use 2 plugins at all. As long as you know why you're doing it and you're not doing extreme things. If you're doing things like this, and then you get another band here and you do this, and then you go in and your other plugin, you're kind of like shaping things around again in the high end. That just shows you're doing too many extreme things. So that's not a good thing at all. So, you know, it's okay to use multiple plugins, but just make sure you're not doing overkill. So, and like I said, same in the case of compression and multiband compression, less is more. You want to do a very subtle curve because the instant you boost things a drastic amount, what you'll start to end up with is a very detrimental sound because everything will sound EQ'd. It won't sound shaped, it'll sound EQ'd, which is not a good thing. So, so that's why you want to do very subtle changes. But at the same time, make sure you do them in the right spots and kind of listen to the track. Don't just follow this, except for the 30 hertz cut. You could just do that. I don't care. But everywhere else, you want to listen to the track and hear where should I really be shooting for cutting or boosting things. Now, if you already create an analog roll-off sort of sound to your track when you mix, you might not need to do this. You might just want to do a very sharp cut at around here, just kind of make sure nothing kind of falls through. But otherwise, you should be fine. And then this one, you just kind of want to always do, once again, to tame the bass. But otherwise, these general areas, you might EQ them differently. I was lucky because Dava's track happens to be very similar to the sound signature of my tracks after I get out of mixing them. So I kind of knew what to do with this track right off the bat. So now, obviously, there is one final thing we're going to have to do. Actually, 2 things that I want to show you, but one final thing we're going to have to do by way of this track is we're going to have to check the various areas to make sure all the sounds shine through in the same way they did before, and we didn't like mess up the track by EQing it. So we'll kind of jump to different areas, A, B, and kind of listen for the sound. So the most important part here that we're checking is to make sure the track still shines through and we didn't really mess anything up. The one part that I was very worried about is this part right here because the dynamics are so good right here. I didn't want to EQ something that would make it lose some of the dynamics. And not so much the dynamics, actually, the stereo placement of the instruments. This is one of my favorite parts of the track just because of how nice it comes in. So it still shines through there, so we don't need to worry about the EQ much. And we can kind of just leave it as is. We don't have to worry about fixing things or going back and re-EQing everything. So so now one thing keep in mind is try to EQ based on overall your entire track, not section by section, because if you do section by section, like you have one EQ for this section, one EQ for this section, and you kind of like have them turn on and off, then it'll just sound weird. So do one EQ for your entire track, unless there's like two very different deliberate sections that have a good transition between them that allows you to switch the EQs without it being a deal. But otherwise, just do it over the entire track. So to wrap this video up, I want to show you one more tool. That's a multimeter, and we might have already touched on this, but this has some good tools. Particularly, I want to look at the analyzer here. And what the analyzer allows you to do is kind of watch these sound signatures. So I'm going to hold the peak here so kind of show you what's going on. So you'll notice with this kind of track, what we have here is it goes up, bumps down, goes up again, and then goes down. That's what this kind of looks like on this one. You'll notice it looks slightly different on our linear EQ, linear phase EQ, when we have the analyzer running. This one's a lot more downward sloping than this one, but otherwise it's generally the same idea. We have a bump here, a drop here, and then a bump here. That's generally what your track should look like in the end. Now, when I actually did the other EQ here, it was kind of funny. Because it ended up looking like this. Which basically is almost exactly what it needs to be here by way of the double bump on this one. Now, my suggestion is if you kind of want to see more what I'm talking about, get some professional tracks and look at them with this analyzer, and you could really see a lot more what that's talking about. But if you switch this to RMS, you kind of get an idea of what it's like overall. So you'll notice that one's a lot more obvious by its downward sloping curve when we have this in RMS. I could set it to RMS fast as well. And it's still the downward sloping trend. So that's just kind of something to keep an eye out for. So if your track ever goes up or stays up around here, I'll turn off the EQs to kind of show you what I mean. If I turn off all the EQs and we're back to the original track, watch what happens to this high end. It's a lot less sloped. So instead of having it so it was more downwards, like I'll reset this and show you again. Instead of having it cut off like that much, it's cutting off like at the very, very end of it. So that's one thing you kind of want to watch out for. If you're going up in this region at all, if it ever goes up, then you are doing something wrong. But if you just kind of have like a downward slope that's very close to the edge here, you might want to bring it down just a little bit. Once again, if you want to start using the meters though, you need to know what you're looking for before you start looking at it. So once again, pull in some professional tracks, listen to them, and kind of gauge it based on that. You know, just generally speaking, what their sound signature tends to look like. And then when you're doing your master, listen first, do your EQs as best you can, and then double check with the meter to make sure that everything kind of matches up to what you hear. So that's pretty much all I had to cover by way of EQ for mastering in this video. Once again, if you guys want to send me tracks for August and September of this year, I am going to be doing a couple more videos on mastering just to kind of show you guys examples. If I can get some tracks in, if I can't get tracks in, I might do maybe one full example and then just switch on to a different series, which I'm still hoping that I'll get into a vocal mini series here, but we'll see how that works out. But yeah, if you guys send me your tracks, like I said, so far Dav is the only one that has sent me a track. But if you guys send me your tracks, then I will do a master for it, and I will actually walk through the entire process of what I did for that master, so you guys can get some examples. Hopefully we'll have some variety there, and we'll actually get that going. So you guys, don't be bashful. Go ahead, send me your full original track, and then I'll get back to you and say, hey, send it to me through this, and then I'll do a master for your track. Just kind of want to make sure that you know, I'm not going to master a 30-second clip of a song. I do want to master your full best work, not just something you kind of threw together in 10 seconds. So so that's kind of why I have that. Send me it first, and then I'll get back to you and with the instructions on how you could send me the full thing, so I could send you the master. So so that's it for today's video. I talked about quite a few things here. The multimeter here, I don't use that often, but I do use it sometimes just to kind of check. Most of the time, I actually don't use meterings. I just kind of listen. But you'll kind of see here, this EQ and this EQ are the two different EQs that I had, and they're very, very, very similar. You actually could easily get mixed up which one's which. So I actually kind of like this EQ more because the high end tapers off a little bit better, but at the same time, I have to listen on my monitors for the final check, whereas this one, it kind of bumps down a little bit. So this is the one that I did last time when I was doing the video. This one kind of seems a bit more tame in the way it kind of curves. So so I might actually end up using this one. It sounds a little bit nicer in the high end, doesn't sound quite as shelved, and at the same time, it kind of looks a bit nicer by way of what type of EQ I'm doing. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. And next video, I'm hoping to get into some examples by way of just EQs, not necessarily EQs, but full masters, kind of showing you guys everything from start to finish, what you do for a master, and how that kind of plays out. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.